Over the weekend, Chinese and Philippines vessels collided with each other in the South China Sea. Here is what it looked like. We'll have more on that clip in just a moment, but both sides blame each other for it. And it's all part of an uptick in tensions that have been witnessed in that particular region in the South China Sea. And that is what we're discussing today on News Desk. I'm Biresh Banerjee.
And I'm Amian Isif. I'm going to be watching out for your comments and your questions in our live chat. If you guys want to know from our experts who we're going to have on the show what the details are, if you have any questions for them, or if you even want to voice off, I'll be looking for that and bringing it into the conversation as we go along.
And I think we've already started receiving some comments on that. And I think, Amian, you might have
That's right. I have a couple of comments already because we always post in the community section on our YouTube page. So you can comment before the show and give us your feedback. We usually form our show around that too. Valence Bellator says, DW is always so spinelessly neutral. So calling us out for being too neutral on the subject. China is actively ramming Philippine ships in their own territorial waters that are recognized as such and reconfirmed by an international court as such by everyone not named China. So very thoroughly here on the Philippine side of the argument. Then we have Amit Kumar, who said, or the question should be, can China and Mexico stop the US Coastguard? How does that sound? Self-declared democracy savers. Another harsh comment here, but I think the point is fair enough that the US involvement in that area, China has at points likened to what if China was in the Caribbean and was exerting its influence there, which obviously the US would not stand for.
Yeah, and we can discuss a US involvement in some time when our experts get on the line. Make sure you keep sending us your comments. They will be in the community chat, and that's where we will grab them from. Just to introduce you to the people sitting at the table today, Alex Forrest-Whiting, an old News Desk hand, joining us today, who should be providing us some context on where we are with these tensions in the South China Sea. Welcome, Alex. And talking to you guys in the chat will be Jared Reed, another trusted News Desk hand. He'll be moderating some of the comments and just also following along and seeing what it is that you all are saying. And later, as Amian was saying, we'll be joined by two geopolitical experts, Don McLean Gill, an analyst from Manila, and we'll also be speaking to William Yang, who's a freelance journalist who has covered issues in the South China Sea, and particularly China, over many years.
That's right. So, as we move along, we have a poll that we always do before the show. So Jared has the details on that for you.
Yeah, so we've got a poll question for you. It is war in the South China Sea now inevitable? And we have 4 options for you to choose from. Yes, no, don't know, and finally, not if diplomacy works. We've got just under 150 votes. We'd love to get those votes up, so please do scroll up to the top of the chat and get your votes in.
And we shall have those results later on in the stream. But let's get started. And this is where Alex comes in with some of the context that we were talking about. Because, Alex, we played that clip a short while back. That's not the entirety of the clip. But then there has been some reaction to that clip, right? And that reaction has come from outside Asia, hasn't it?
Exactly. That reaction in particular has come from the European Union, which has accused China of taking dangerous actions against the Philippines. Now, China responded to that, basically saying, keep your nose out of our business. This has nothing to do with you. The South China Sea issue is far away and nothing to do with you. So really the question is, you know, why is Brussels, why are other countries showing so much interest and concern about what is going on in the South China Sea? I think there are probably 2 reasons why. Number one, this is not an isolated incident. It's becoming an issue of security. And number 2, the whole economic framing here. This is a massive trade route, a huge shipping route, which which I'll talk about in a moment. First of all, this is not an isolated case. Well, if we can just share my screen for a moment. We're looking at Google Earth here, and this is the South China Sea that that we're looking at the moment. And there have been various aggressive incidents around there concerning, in particular, Chinese Coast Guards and also Filipino Coast Guards. And just to put that into context, in the last month, there have been 5 incidents in the Spratly Islands. That's why that has got a red marker there just to show you. And some of those in particular have focused around 2 particular areas. One is the Sabina Shoal here, and another one just further in, if we can see that, is the Second Thomas Shoal. But in the Sabina Shoal, this is where, in the past few months, but back in June, there was quite an particularly aggressive incident at the Second Thomas Shoal. And I was actually involved in producing a video on what was happening there, and that involved having obviously to look at a lot of the footage that was coming in from both China and the Philippines. And I can just show some of that now. If I just share my screen with you, make this big so that you can, 1 second, so that you can see it. And basically, we have here, this is footage from the Philippines. We are looking at Chinese Coast Guard. That's an axe that we're seeing there. So they were carrying an axe. They were also carrying knives. In a moment, we're going to see, well, this is them obviously hitting the Filipino boat here. We have a sailor from Manila who has apparently lost a thumb in this incident. We have tear gas being fired here. And also, we will see in a moment some of the other weapons, such as, here we are, knives that are being used there. And there they are slashing that boat, a Filipino boat, with those knives. So that's
this isn't harmless. People are actually getting hurt here.
Exactly, and that is just an example of, and here's some of the damage that was done to the Filipino ship. So this is just an example of why people are getting particularly concerned about what is going on there.
This is from June, wasn't it?
And this is from June, yes.
Yeah.
We've got hopefully got the link that you can put it in the chat if anybody is interested in that. And also, just to say that if you do want to see the original footage, which came from some of the agencies, that's on X, and I think you can put that in as well. But secondly, for many of these countries, the South China Sea, as I said before, is a vital shipping route. It's worth trillions of dollars in trade. In fact, I think they say around 1/3 of global maritime trade passes through that area. So if we just go back, if I just come out here, you can just see, again, that map of where we're talking about here. And there is concern that China is threatening that because of the aggression that is going on with these boats. So here we have another website. This is the Maritime Traffic website here. You can just see how much traffic that's at the moment, so this is live, is in the South China Sea as we speak. Incidentally, this here that I'm pointing to is a Chinese Coast Guard, which you can see is very close to the Spratly Islands at the moment. So that's just one that actually, Amian, you tracked down a little bit earlier.
Yeah, if you zoom in, you can actually see it. It's poised right next to the island. Yeah.
So if I go in, but then...
The thing is, too, what's interesting in a lot of these maps, you see how they're called the Spratly Islands, but there's not much island to them, right?
No, exactly.
So in a lot of maps, they just appear as like a darker ring in the water because a lot of them aren't even above the surface of the water. So it's not really the land they're defending as much as the location in this very important sea, right?
Completely. And part of the reason why, I'm just going to show another map now. This is a DW map. I'll make this a bit bigger as well. So part of it is that China claims up to 90% of the South China Sea. And it uses this, if you can see there's this red, there are lots of lines here, I know it's a bit confusing. It's about all the different countries who claim some of the rights over the South China Sea, over various islands. But this red dash line, it's a 9-dash line, is what China bases its claims on and says this is why what's in here is basically all ours. And even though the Philippines went to an international court of arbitration to challenge China on that, and actually the Philippines won that case back in 2016, nothing seems to have changed. Tensions have just intensified, and nobody seems to be backing down at all. And of course, as well as this being a very important trade route, there are also very important things inside this part of the world. We've got it's rich in oil and gas, rare earth minerals, which are useful for everyone. So you can see why this is just so contested and why it is not going away.
But it's not just because of the trade and the rare earths and minerals that are available there, right? I mean, it's also because of China, because China's always made these claims, but it's basically become more assertive in recent years, particularly in the 2000s and onwards. So it's also about China in a sense, potentially, and we can ask the expert when he joins us, about China making its claims known, especially as it sees itself as a superpower, and particularly the resident power in Asia.
Yes,
we
that's
can discuss
true.
all of that. But thanks for that, Alex. Let's just sort of take this forward and get the perspective from the Philippines on that. Joining me now on the line from Manila is Don McLean Gill. He's a geopolitical analyst and a lecturer at De La Salle University in Manila. Don, thanks so much for making the time. I realize it's rather late in Manila, but still you've made the time. We appreciate it. Let me just start right away and ask you about what the Philippines is doing here, because it was in April, if I'm not wrong, that the Philippines deployed the BRP Teresa Magbauna. I hope I got that right. The largest Coastguard ship with the Philippines in Sabina Shoal. Why was that? Why did the Philippines have to deploy this ship in the first place?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Birish. It's great to join you all here today. And regarding your question, that's an excellent start. We'd have to put this into context, though. Since August, particularly, the Chinese Coast Guard has managed to fully open up a strategic front against the Philippines for its illicit and expansionist activities in the Sabina Shoal. So August 10, August 25th, and August 29th, and of course the 31st of August, we have had a number of physical provocations by the Chinese Coast Guard, repeated rammings, blocking supply missions or humanitarian missions towards the BRP Teresa Magbanwa, which is the largest Philippine Coast Guard ship. Now, let's add more context to this. Now, the Sabina Shoal is located 140 kilometers west of the Philippine province of Palawan, right? And it's well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone based on international law, based on UNCLOS, and cemented by the 2016 arbitral ruling. So it is also very close to the energy-rich Reed or Recto Bank. And it is also serving as a meeting point for resupply missions to the BRP Sierra Madre, which is at the Ayungin Shoal, or the second Thomas Shoal, which is also well within the Philippine exclusive economic zone. And most importantly, we can see that because of the strategic importance of the Sabina Shoal, it has been factored in China's expansionist strategy. So there were initial evidences of China's reclamation activities there, the dumping of corals, and there were Chinese researchers along the area. And clearly under UNCLOS, having these forms of researches in a coastal state's EEZ, these countries or foreign actors must seek permission from that country, and that is clearly the Philippines, right? So recognizing this interest, the Philippine Coast Guard sent its BRP Teresa Magbanwa, and it has been there since April to ensure the presence and the ability of the Philippines to secure its sovereign rights. But of course, China has been frustrated. So we have seen these events.
So what exactly is China's plan then? What does China intend to do in Sabina Shoal?
Well, it's not just about the Sabina Shoal. When we look into China's activities, not only in the West Philippine Sea, or what we call the part of the South China Sea that encompasses the Philippines' lawful 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, we should look at it based on the broader context of China's expansionism towards the greater South China Sea. So it is crucial also to understand these recent incidents, based on the relationship between China's risk perception and of course the idea of de-escalation. Now, when Manila and Beijing announced their provisional agreement on July 21st to de-escalate tensions at the Second Thomas Shoal or the Ayungin Shoal, Beijing largely participated perhaps because it felt that this was a calculated response for China to regroup its maritime forces and recalibrate its options amidst the growing threats of horizontal escalation. And China understands its military limitations and would not want to engage directly in a military standoff or a military shooting war, as the United States was also voicing its interest to take part in escorts, but the Philippines declined at that point. So what we're seeing now is that China is trying to offset its strategic losses, and these assertive maneuvers happened after the signing of after the 21st of July agreement between the Philippines and China. And it's not only in the Sabina Shoal, but we have also seen assertive and irresponsible activities of the Chinese jets above the Bajo de Masinloc, the Scarborough Shoal, which is also within the Philippine exclusive economic zone. So it's all about China offsetting its strategic losses.
May I jump in real quick? Because I just want to parse this a little bit. It's a lot of very complex complex arguments here. So the exclusive economic zone, which is established by international law, that basically gives some rights to a country if in the territorial waters off its shore. If China, and I'm not saying anything about the territorial claims of China, but in a theoretical situation where a country has an island that happens to be within the exclusive economic zone of another country, then it's a moot point, right? For example, Cuba is 90 miles off of the coast of Florida, which is U.S. territorial waters, but Cuba is a sovereign country. So then it's a moot point. So the argument that the International Court has ruled in favor of the Philippines in terms of protecting its rights to the waters off the coast, it doesn't say anything about who owns the Spratly Islands, who owns the Sabina Shoal, right? So these islands are contested, and that hasn't really been determined internationally who has the rights to these islands.
Right. So, but we have to understand that the 2016 arbitral ruling was not a sovereignty case, but a case for clarification. And based on that case, it is clear that these areas fall within the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. And this is why the passing or the supposed signing of a new law, which is the Maritime Zones Act, would clearly illustrate the Philippines' commitment to international law by renaming or at least recalibrating its claims based on UNCLOS and the 2016 arbitral ruling. But we can see here that if we look into the map, the 9-line, 10-line, Chinese claims do not necessarily abide by international law. And this is why this is the problem that we are having right now, because we see China trying to overstretch its claims. And, since the 1990s has been building artificial islands and militarizing them within the Philippine 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. And that is clear that who is in the right side of international law. I think it's quite clear. So this is not just a Philippines or a US-China issue, but it's an issue that entails the provocation against the Philippines' lawful exclusive economic zone.
Yeah, I mean, it just to be clear, Don, that there are other competing claims. It's not just with China, but there are other competing claims with other nations in Southeast Asia who also claim parts of the Spratlys. But if I can just come back to Sabina Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal, which both are part of the Spratly Islands, there were reports that China intends to eject the Philippines entirely from these two shoals and establish complete control over these shoals. Is that something that you're hearing in Manila as well?
Well, definitely. I mean, with the frustration that China has, especially since it would not be able to carry out its supposed reclamation activities discreetly, and it is quite frustrated with the Philippine presence there. So, if we look into the nature of its aggression against Philippine ships in August, we can see that the goal here is not only to destroy the operational capabilities of the limited ships that the Philippine Coast Guard has, the Philippines has, but to also cut off the supplies that are given towards the Magbanwa and the crew there. So definitely, I think it's quite clear what China is trying to do. It's trying to choke the supplies and make sure that the Philippine position becomes diminished in that particular part of uh, uh, the area.
You know,
So I think it's quite clear. Yeah.
let's just throw up a map. I think Alex on the table has an access to the map, just so that we know what we're talking about exactly.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, I've just outlined here, that's Sabina Shoal on the right and that's Second Thomas Shoal on the left. And you can see that that piece of land there is part of the Philippines on the right. So I just wanted to make it very clear about what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Very tiny areas.
Exactly, but very important areas nonetheless. You were talking a short while back about China potentially being on the back foot after this July agreement with the Philippines to regulate access to this area. What did you mean by that? Why is China on the back foot? Why is China having to have another look at its strategic options, given that when it comes to size, at least the size of the maritime militia, the size of Chinese maritime power, it far outweighs and outdoes whatever the Philippines can generate and throw into the area?
Well, right. And, I've always made a pretty stark comparison between what's happening in that area towards a de-escalatory phase and what happened in Ladakh, Eastern Ladakh as well. So we can clearly see that what China
This is the border with India, just for
reference.
reference, for people who don't really know. Eastern Ladakh, Don is there, is referring to the northeastern border, the undetermined border with China. Please go on, Don.
Thank you. So what we are seeing right now is that what China feels is that, of course, since the 1990s, China has successfully been able to alter not just the geography through its artificial island building, but the balance of power of the greater South China Sea without the overt use of military force, right? So it was never part of the short to midterm plan of China to escalate the situation towards a shooting war. But when it comes to the Philippines, you have to understand that it's just not between the two countries. The Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States, and based on the Mutual Defense Treaty between Manila and Washington, if there is an armed attack against the Philippine ships, which was later clarified in 2018-2019, that the scope of the Mutual Defense Treaty would also cover Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, that the United States will definitely come and support the Philippine position there. Now, whether it is ambiguous enough or not is another story for discussion. But the mere fact is that when the United States voiced its willingness to come and take part in the resupply activities, that opens up chances for more miscalculation between the U.S. and China. And along with public condemnation, of course, I guess that the next step for China was to make sure that it simmers down tensions in that part of the greater South China Sea, and to ensure that it is still able to offset its losses in other parts. I mentioned the Scarborough Shoal and the Sabina Shoal. So it's not about we don't know how long this agreement would hold, right? So that's another concern that we have. Yeah, so that's an issue.
Just for all these guys who are tuning in, we do intend to talk about the United States and the 2 points that Don brought up there about the Mutual Defense Treaty and also the support that the United States has extended to the Philippines, offering to accompany Philippines ships and vessels on these resupply missions. We will discuss that, but a little later in the discussion. Right now, we'd just like to sort of stick with the Philippines. And on this point, if I can just ask you, Don, to explain to us how Philippines' foreign policy has essentially changed with the change in power in Manila, because you had Rodrigo Duterte, who was very hesitant to take on the Chinese and to stand up to Chinese activities in the region. And now you have President Bongbong Marcos, who isn't afraid to challenge the Chinese for what the Philippines claims is its territorial waters. What exactly is the change that has happened? And more importantly, why this change now?
Right. So these are really good points that you have mentioned, Birish. And we have to understand that under the Duterte administration, the former Duterte administration, there was this belief in Manila that, or from Duterte himself, that we will be able to, gain economically from forging warmer, more appeasing ties towards China, while sidelining, of course, the 2016 arbitral ruling, which just came out under his administration, and by cooling ties down with the United States. So with that sort of signaling, perhaps the Philippines would be able to gain economically from China and inevitably lessen the conflicts that has taken place within the Philippine exclusive economic zone. But unfortunately, throughout most of the years, China's economic pledges were barely operationalized, merely a fraction. Chinese ODA was simply at single digits and going backwards, actually. And on top of that, China was continuously swarming and creating provocations in a number of features that fall within Philippine exclusive economic zone. The Whitsun Reef, for instance, and all of that. So clearly, Duterte made a U-turn towards 2020, realizing that the whole idea was not really sustainable.
Right.
Now, under President Marcos Jr., we have to understand that there was an attempt from Manila to ensure the ties with Beijing are managed. That's why President Marcos Jr. went there in Beijing in January 2023.
Right.
However, just a few weeks after, China began pointing laser-grade technology towards the Philippine ships, towards the crew, and a number of ramming incidents, water cannon incidents that became normalized. So clearly, President Marcos Jr. realized that in order to get Beijing towards the negotiating table, I mean, negotiation is definitely the end goal for Manila. It was never to escalate any situation. We are merely on the defensive here within our exclusive economic zone.
That did occur to me, though, that when we're talking about the China expansionist program creating this uptick in clashes in the South China Sea, especially off the coast of the Philippines, that we're saying that was the start of why we're seeing so many clashes. But it does, the argument has been made that it was a change in Philippine policy to be more hardlined on protecting what it sees as its, basically its territory. So you don't believe that that's the case, that it's the change in the Filipino policy that has created this uptick in clashes in the sea?
Well, not at all, because we have to understand that even under the Duterte administration, which was pursuing a largely appeasement approach towards China, China still continued what it was doing, to the point where the defense and foreign policy establishments in the Philippines were voicing concern and pushing back against what China was trying to forward against Philippine national interests. And this was ongoing throughout the whole 6 years. What we are doing now under President Marcos Jr. is that we are clearly realizing the challenge. We are not trying to push it under the carpet. And of course, with that, there would be an increase in frustration in Beijing as well. So we could clearly see that that also added to the problem. But again, we have to understand that, these assertive maneuvers were there. It was present, especially since 2010, when Manila decided to reorient its security strategy towards territorial defense and maritime security under the late former President Benigno Aquino III. So we can clearly see that this is a continuation of what China has been doing. But of course, the intensity may fluctuate a little bit based on how Manila now is more steadfast and standing up for what it believes to be rightfully its own based on international law.
We'll be speaking to somebody about what China is thinking. But before we do that, I do have one other question for you, Don. And it is that in the middle of all this assertiveness that we are seeing from Manila and we are seeing from Beijing as well, China continues to be the largest trading partner of the Philippines. Is there concern at all in Manila that this might cease being the case, the more assertive or the more Manila is ready to stand up to Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea?
Well, we have to understand it this way. And in fact, it was the opposite argument that was made by many in Manila or in the Philippines that tried to discredit what the current president is doing, always linking standing up to China in the Philippine exclusive economic zone, directly assimilating it to a degrade in economic relations with Beijing. Right. And Marcos Jr. has shown that this is not the case. We are able to engage with China in different forms of cooperation. We continue to harness a number of important negotiations and cooperative arrangements. But at the same time, this should not restrain Manila's ability to secure its sovereignty and sovereign rights based on international law. So I think that if we look at it in this way, this is actually proving many of those that try to undermine the administration or try to undermine the economic prospects of the Philippines with China to be a weak argument. But of course, the Philippines recognizes the need to diversify economic relations, right? So one of the key areas of concern is, of course, critical minerals. The Philippines is the second largest producer of nickel, and over 90% or close to 90% of our exports goes to China. And this is why the Luzon Economic Corridor, which is a framework for infrastructure development between Manila, Tokyo, and Washington, that's something that the Philippines is looking towards in the long term to diversify its economic prospects. But till then, obviously, being pragmatic, we understand that we cannot cut China off. Mm-hmm. China is our largest immediate neighbor and the largest economic power within our immediate neighborhood. But we have shown that while maintaining economic ties and negotiating in other areas, that does not mean that we should not stand up for Philippine national interests in this regard. So I think that it was wonderfully made, and public opinion agrees. Public opinion remains relatively supportive of the Philippines' approach.
Did you want to bring some comments in?
No, I'll bring in, sorry. You can bring in William already. We have a journalist waiting for us.
Let's take the discussion forward and talk about the role that China is playing here. I mean, China is the other main character here. And to help us talk about that and discuss that further, I'm joined by William Yang, who is ordinarily based in Taipei, but on this occasion joining us from Stockholm, I believe. William, thanks for making the time. William is a freelance journalist who has covered the Southeast Asia region and particularly China's actions in the South China Sea for a number of years. It's good to have you on, William. I don't know how much of the conversation you got between us and Don, but then how do you see what China's game plan currently is in Sabina Shoal particularly?
I think what the Chinese is definitely trying to do is to test the durability of both the bilateral defense mutual treaty between the Philippines and the United States, but at the same time, in fact, trying to get a better sense about how effective the U.S.-led coalition is with regard to the efforts to push back against the Chinese aggression in the South China Sea overall. And so even though they reached a very temporary sort of like ceasefire or deal earlier this year around the Second Thomas Shoal, which was another flashpoint prior to the Sabina Shoal, I think they are trying to do this multi-pronged and multi-front kind of like approach to really distract and at the same time weaken the Philippines' ability to defend its own interests. Because as we know, Sabina Shoal lies even closer to the Philippines, but in the Chinese eyes, basically, the entire West Philippine Sea falls into its territorial claim. And I think timing of the timing that they have chosen to do this is also very important. We need to remember that in the coming weeks, there will be two major leadership elections in both Japan and the United States. And these are two of the most important countries that are given actual support, defense-related support and cooperation with the Philippines. And with possible change of guard in both Tokyo and Washington in the coming months, this will extend all the way until January 20th next year, because that's when a new government in Washington, D.C. will took office. And they believe that during this period of time, Washington will have very limited attention to be able to focus on what is happening in Indo-Pacific in general. So that's why I think they're opening a new front right now and really trying to get a better sense about how effective and how forceful the responses coming from Manila, but also its allies will be.
I want to bring in a question from Rob, who says the Chinese government is difficult to talk to because what they say often does not match what they do. Many Filipinos do not trust them because they have aggrieved our fishermen and sailors a lot. So a comment coming from a Filipino. Is China concerned about its messaging here? Does it want to convince the world that it's right, or is this just sheer power politics?
I think at this point, it really looks like Beijing doesn't really care how its behavior is being viewed around the world, in particular in the Philippines, because we know that the Filipino public opinion has been trending very much anti-China ever since the clashes and the confrontation between the Philippines and China has increased since last year. The Pew Research Center's their opinion poll has repeatedly shown that the Philippine public opinion is really swinging towards anti-China, and the distrust of China is really increasing. And I think its actions, especially following that bloody incident at Second Thomas Shoal earlier this year, has further, I think, strengthened the belief in the Philippines that China is the vicious actor here, and the Chinese is disregarding the life and also the general safety of Filipino citizens to just simply want to impose its territorial claims. And I think from Beijing's perspective, especially Xi Jinping is a leader who very much is ideologically locked into this idea that China is the power on the rise. And by reinforcing that image, its way of doing so is to become more forceful in different parts of the world, and in especially the area that it considers as its backyard, which is South China Sea, where it is really facing strengthened coordination and coalition that is pushing back against its attempt to really take control of the territorial waters. It is now believing that the only way for them is to push back, because it sees that if it doesn't reinforce and project and impose its claims forceful enough, then it is only going to allow the U.S. to further contain it. And that is not something that Xi Jinping will allow, especially now that he is entering his third term, but possibly even fourth term.
Just one quick observation. I know you want to come in, but just one quick observation, because William, you called it Xi Jinping thinking of this as China's backyard. And it's an interesting thing that you brought up there, because China has always said over and over again that the Indian Ocean isn't India's ocean, for example, but when it comes to the South China Sea, it almost seems to consider it to be China's sea. Just want to sort of bring that observation based on what you were saying there.
It's interesting, too, from the perspective of U.S. power. You know, the Monroe Doctrine. In the early 1800s, they said that any interference in the Western Hemisphere was their backyard. So this word backyard is being used against U.S. interests now from Beijing. I don't know if that's a direct quote, backyard, but the concept is already there. Matthew asks, what is the feeling with ordinary Philippine citizens with China's aggressive behavior towards them? Don, maybe you can comment on that.
Right, that's an excellent question. And we have to understand that there have been a series of reportings and thorough documentations of particularly the fishermen, the Filipino fishermen who have been at sea and have bore the brunt of Chinese assertiveness within the West Philippine Sea. Now, they have been very frustrated and very much aggrieved by the fact that China does not abide by the proper modes of conduct in engaging with neighbors. And clearly there is no sign of that. And in Manila, of course, in line with the growing level of perception, public perception, one of the key facets, one of the key elements in Manila's multi-pronged approach is the Transparency Initiative. and it is an element in Manila's overarching position and approach to the West Philippine Sea. Now, that provides the Filipino people with the clarity of what's actually taking place against the Filipino fishermen, against Philippine sailors within the Philippine exclusive economic zone. And when they see that the common fisherman, the common sailor, are being provoked unnecessarily, right? And that that serves as a unifying factor, right? That continues to consolidate and support whatever President Marcos Jr. is trying to do, clearly because it is a very people-centric approach. And that was the crux of the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept, which was implemented by the Philippine military to ensure that the Philippine sovereignty and sovereign rights are secured for the benefit of the people. And this is why we can see that public sentiment is, in fact, increasing, because they could say that this is a direct issue affecting a common Filipino citizen and the common Filipino citizens' interests at sea. So this is something that resonates well within the general public.
If I can come to you, William, you call this a new front, speaking specifically about the Sabina Shoal in terms of China probing and trying to see how the Philippines would respond, given that these elections are coming up in Japan and the United States. But could it also be that China would actually, if it had the opportunity and if it could have control over Sabina Shoal and potentially Second Thomas Shoal, actually build on these features, military outposts or military bases, the way it has done with Mischief Reef? And I think in total it has something like 20 outposts already in the Paracel Islands and 7 already in the Spratlys. Would the ultimate aim be the militarization of Second Thomas Shoal and Sabina Shoal?
So I believe there was already some concerns being expressed earlier this year that the Philippines has observed that the Chinese are having some movement or actions, developments near the Sabina Shoal. And so that is certainly some, I think, speculation that the Chinese aim goal is to further its foothold, especially military presence in the South China Sea, so that its claim, its control of the key international waterway will become even more difficult to counter and push back. And so I think that is why a lot of the regional experts, especially maritime security experts, are now calling on the United States to consider even more forceful presence and forceful ways of pushing back against Beijing, because they view that clearly the statements of condemnation is not enough. They have raised different ways of perhaps deterring China from further enhancing its presence in the region by increasing the freedom of navigation operations in the region, involving some allies, including even from Europeans, and at the same time opening up a formal consultation, at least, of the Mutual Defense Treaty with Manila. But I think at this particular moment, the Marcos government is trying to walk a very fine line and publicly refusing to acknowledge that they are seeking the United States in terms of the support of those resupply missions. They have, I think, reiterated that they are determined to rely on themselves until the last moment, and then unless they really see the need of involving the United States in these resupply missions. But I think with the frequency and the rate of escalation of these tensions that we have seen over the last few months, and how dangerous it is for especially Philippines Coastguard, it does seem like Manila probably will need to consider other options, probably even involving its Navy, in order to better safeguard the interests of the Philippine Coast Guard and also its fishermen in the region.
Don, I've looked at a lot of what the Philippine responses are, and there is always this idea, given that there are a number of options that the Philippine military has considered before it even starts talking about asking for US help. What are some of those options? I mean, how can Manila stand up to the overwhelming maritime might of China without directly involving the United States?
Well, clearly, I definitely agree with William there that there is an attempt in Manila and the armed forces of the Philippines to try to exhaust these particular options. And some of these options may be novel ways to resupply humanitarian supplies to the BRP Sierra Madre and the Teresa Magbanwa. And I think one of the options here was that, yes, we were able to forge some sort of agreement with China on the Ayungin Shoal and the resupply missions to the BRP Sierra Madre, but now we are seeing an open front in the Sabina Shoal and the areas above the Bajo de Masinloc or the Scarborough Shoal. So clearly, these new fronts have also challenged the natural calculations or the expectations of the Philippines towards these very options. So I think that the Philippines is still open. I mean, the Philippines is open to the idea of having the United States escort Philippine resupply missions, but it's all about the time. And I feel that as the situation continues to exacerbate, the idea of involving such mechanisms would be more and more likely. And especially that, we have the US presidential elections coming up. The United States itself would not try to look weak in this part of the world. So I think that the US would also be on board with the idea more, given the timing. So it's all about the timing and the level of threat perception that Manila would be feeling based on the structural impediments. But it's not against the idea.
Right.
It's still trying to see how long it could go before using that idea.
Okay, let's hold our thought on the U.S. involvement because that is the next part of the discussion that I'd like to go into. But before we do that, one question for you, William. This is something that I'm seeing in the chat. It's something that we were discussing earlier as well, Ami. And this is from user Ajit Prasad KK, who's asking, why are Europeans so interested in the South China Sea? I know it's a bit of a tangent, but can you answer that question directly, William?
So the South China Sea is one of the busiest trading routes around the world. A lot of the important goods that is manufactured in Asia, including in Taiwan, the semiconductors, I think oftentimes we'll have to go through that route. And so with the frequency and the general level of traffic that has to go through that part of the world in order to ensure that goods and commodities can reach different parts of the world, including Europe. The freedom of navigation of South China Sea and the non-militarization and the status quo, maintaining the status quo of the South China Sea is in the interest not only just for regional countries or for countries that has a strategic interest in the region, but also just for other countries that heavily rely on maritime trading routes to maintain its economy.
And I'm just bringing up again the map that I showed earlier, this maritime map, which just shows what is actually travelling through the South China Sea as we speak. So that's a live map with the red and the green. And as I said before, the flashing dot in the middle is a Chinese Coastguard ship that, as you can see, is very close to Philippines, or you might even say within the economic zone of the Philippines, but very close.
If you scroll through that, you can see that most of the ships are cargo ships or fishing ships.
Yeah.
So it's really most of those thousands of dots. And if you zoom into, you can see it's way more than you think from the bird's eye view. But most of them are about trade.
Yeah, but just staying on that map, if you can just zoom out a bit, you can see that it goes around the coast of Thailand and then through Singapore and Indonesia to the Straits of Malacca, and then going all the way to the west around the tip of India. I mean, it's just strategic traffic, and whoever controls these waterways essentially controls a lot of the world trade. So that basically is the answer to why a lot of people are interested in this waterway and the freedom of navigation there. You know what, William, thanks so much for joining us today for this section of the discussion. Thanks for making the time. I think we'll be talking again on this particular issue, because this issue is not really going away anytime soon. But William, thanks so much for joining us today from Stockholm.
Thank you.
Don, continue to stay on the line. We'll come to you. But before that, I'd just like to go to Jared, who has been in the community talking to all the guys who've been commenting and watching this stream for an idea on what the community has been feeling, what the mood is.
There's a lot going on, I can tell you. Carolina's been giving us a bit of an idea of what it's like to live in the Philippines and be thinking about this. And she has made the point that, this is on the minds of a lot of people in the Philippines, but lots of people are living in survival mode because of other issues that are really important to them, like natural disasters that are happening right now. We had a user from China saying, in fact, the majority of Chinese people don't really care about these tensions. This is not really being discussed in Chinese social media. And then someone replied and said, well, the majority of Chinese people don't really have a say in what's going on. One question I did want to pose, maybe we can touch on it briefly, and I promised to do it to you, 84YVY, because you asked it twice. He's asking, or they're asking, can any expert explore the risks for sea and international connectivity with these increasing tensions, which is like linking to this whole trade aspect that we were talking about?
That's one for Don, I think.
Right. So the aspect of trade isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And, that is highly interlinked with the very nature of the greater geopolitics of the South China Sea. Now, connectivity has been very much on the high in that part of the world, right? In this part of the world, we have the RCEP, we have the CPTPP, for instance, and all these mechanisms to ensure regional economic integration within Southeast and East Asia. And this is clearly seen, especially with the momentum shifting towards the significance of RCEP. But at the same time, along with as level of economic interdependence continues to rise, so will the chances for asymmetric dependence. And this is where one party clearly has the upper hand in trade relations against the other. And this is where this could be linked with other forms of geopolitical or traditional security issues and how economics can eventually be militarized. This has been one of the major concerns of Southeast Asian countries. And one of the factors that have really inhibited that level of hedging between and among Southeast Asian countries against the US and China is that China's economic clout in this regard has been so vast and so significant, and it continues to grow to the point that no Southeast Asian country, even the Philippines, is able to make political economic decisions without factoring in the role of China. So there have been comments about saying that it shouldn't just be about the U.S. and China, but this is a structural reality we are all living in. So while we are trying to pursue our autonomy, we cannot be completely disregard the structural realities that we are facing in the region.
Let's bring the discussion back to the role of the United States, because we've been talking a lot about it, and it's hard to talk about the South China Sea issue and the Philippines' role in it without talking about the United States. We did mention the Mutual Defense Treaty that the Philippines concluded with the United States in 1951. I'd like to play a soundbite from the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. He was alluding to this mutual defense treaty when he spoke recently about these current tensions in the South China Sea. Let's just listen to that soundbite, and then we'll continue the discussion after that.
Would the U.S. consider, certainly within the context of consultations, every option between the two sovereign nations in terms of our mutual defense? Escort of one vessel to the other is an entirely reasonable option within our mutual defense treaty among this close alliance between the two of us.
Admiral Paparo there was talking about escorting one vessel as a reasonable option, but before that, he talked about every option between the two sovereign nations when it comes to the mutual defense treaty. What is the meaning of every option? Does this also involve the U.S. shooting at China?
Well, we have to understand the nature of the mutual defense treaty. And there are some, especially in the region, that often mistaken it to be something that you can switch on and off anytime, right? So the MDT, we must be mindful about something of its nature, right? So it is at its heart a consultative process. So Article 3 of the MDT states that, of course, the MDT centers on consultation, and the commander has rightfully said that. So through the foreign ministries of Foreign Ministers Council of the United States and the Philippines, it is up to the foreign ministers through their consultations to implement the necessary steps needed to address particular issues or situations that either one or both parties feel that they have been threatened by. And that in itself, so the idea is to ensure that both sides are able to maximize the provisions proactively. So what we can see here is that the options are not necessarily direct shooting wars, right? So there's this also misperception that so-called activating the MDT would automatically mean that you would have U.S. military assets deployed in this side of the world in war mode, right? So that's not really the case. So the options include not only military, but diplomatic, economic, and normative as well. So the resupply mission idea of being escorted is also one of the options that would be looked at. So it is an ongoing consultation based on the perceived threats. Now, the challenge here is to identify these threats and to define them, right? And to make sure that both sides are on board with the definitions and the clarifications of these provisions. So that's what the consultation is all about. It's not something that you switch on and the military's there, right? So it's something that is based on that process of consultation.
But none of these threats as to what these red lines are have been made public. Is that deliberate, or is it because they simply don't exist because they're so hard to articulate?
And before you answer that question, I just want to bring in a comment from Jesse Wright along these lines. So the PLA Navy, so the Chinese Navy, has clearly studied the text of the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. The CCP, Chinese Communist Party, wouldn't be playing with fire and risking war with the US if this act were covered, meaning the ramming of the ships. So it does seem that China has studied this and is testing the limits of it.
Well, we have to understand that there have been a number of fluctuations and inconsistencies with the Philippine-U.S. alliance, really, in terms of clarifying the MDT and the provisions of the MDT, the geographical scope, right? It was only in 2018, 2019 that geographical scope was largely clarified under former President Trump. Now, when we talk about defining what is an armed attack, so the Indo-PACOM, the U.S. Indo-PACOM, last year, if I'm not mistaken, released a public document. It's declassified. It's easily accessed on the BRP Sierra Madre and what's taking place in the Ayungin or the Second Thomas Shoal. And they defined armed attack. And it's very important to note that based on the Indo-PACOM document, an armed attack could be kinetic or non-kinetic, right? So that opens up the vast array of possibilities that could fall under what an armed attack is. And President Marcos Jr., during the Shangri-La dialogue, for instance, stated that the MDT that armed attack would be considered when a Filipino would lose his or her life in the altercation with China, particularly. So there has to be that clarity for defining. And I think that's the challenge that we're having now, the lack of collective clarity on the definition. So I believe that not defining it right away, right, given these instances, is also something that is considered a smart thing. Given, of course, that if you define something and China goes right up to that red line and you're not able to do things as planned, that would completely discredit the efforts of the US-Philippine alliance. And that's something that China wants to do. It's trying to provoke, it's trying to poke the bear, for lack of a better term. So I think the challenge here for Manila and Washington would be to ensure that they are able to define it for the long term, but not making it seem that it is completely ambiguous and exploitable.
How close are things to going out of control? I mean, we were talking to Alex earlier. She talked about a Filipino Marine losing his thumb in an altercation with the Chinese in June.
Yeah,
was it
at
next
Second Thomas Shoal?
At Second Thomas Shoal.
June 17.
June 17th. At Second Thomas Shoal.
Here's the picture now, if you want to.
Yeah, we can throw that picture up. So that's that's the thing over there. And Don, you know, and I know that China and ASEAN have been talking about a code of conduct in the South China Sea for years now, and we're still nowhere close to that code of conduct, which essentially would have defined how interactions should happen on the South China Sea, something along the lines of the rules that existed between Indian and Chinese troops on the northern border between India and China, as to very specific things such as troops having to point their guns towards the ground when interacting with each other so as to not kick things off. Nothing of that sort exists when it comes to the South China Sea. So how close are we to miscalculations occurring and something more untoward than a Filipino Marine losing his thumb happening?
Right, Girish, and you've mentioned it quite well. And in fact, China has disregarded the agreements with India from the 1990s onwards, and that what happened in the 2020s, right? We saw the result of that. Now, in Southeast Asia, it's much different, right? So going back to your point earlier, you said that, yes, the Philippines also has overlapping maritime claims with other Southeast Asian countries. And that's absolutely right. But the problem is that, the reason why the Philippines is more concerned about China rather than, let's say, Vietnam or Malaysia or Brunei is because Southeast Asian countries understand the significance of UNCLOS in dealing with the provisions of UNCLOS for dispute resolution for the maritime border. Vietnam and Indonesia have done that successfully in December 2022. Now, my point, President Marcos Jr. earlier on suggested that we should have a code of conduct of sorts between and among the Southeast Asian claimant countries. Now, this is well within the principles of the Declaration of the Conduct of Parties on the South China Sea in the early 2000s that encouraged such confidence-building measures. And that is something that the Philippines is doing now with Vietnam. We had the first ever bilateral Coastguard drill with Vietnam a month ago, if I'm not mistaken, and we'd be having a new one, another one by the end of the year. And we had the Vietnamese defense minister arrive in Manila to sign the letters of intent for maritime defense cooperation, which would be signed later on in the year. So this is significant. If the Philippines would be able to cooperate with Vietnam in this regard, eventually while understanding national sensitivities, but having some sort of code of conduct, a bilateral code of conduct to set their actions within the waters, the overlapping waters. That would make it harder for China to really thrive on the fragmentation of Southeast Asia. So that's what we're hoping for.
Can we address a debate that's happening in our comments? Because in the first video we saw, it seemed that what was happening is a Chinese Coast Guard ship was ramming a Philippines Coast Guard ship. In our title, however, we mentioned that we kept it neutral. That was probably the comment about our neutrality. So, yeah, we see this video here. This is the Chinese Coast Guard apparently ramming a Filipino Coast Guard ship. We also have in August 19th, there was an incident, and the Chinese government published a video which they claim shows a Filipino ship ramming a Chinese Coast Guard ship. If we can play that video as well, because that has been used as evidence that it's provocations on both sides. We'll just watch this. You can see in the foreground, that is the Filipino ship apparently, and in the background, it's Chinese ship. So the stern, the bow of the Filipino ship hits the bow and stern. The bow of the Filipino ship apparently rams into the Chinese ship. What the Filipino side said was that it was they got in their way. Anyway, maybe you can address this video and what your explanation is.
Right. Yeah, I actually, the comment has some significant nuance. So we see what happened on the 31st of August, for instance. China said it was the Philippines who rammed. The Chinese Coast Guard ship, and in fact, to the point where it tried to say that both are blaming one another for ramming. But clearly, ironically, in the videos illustrated and shown by China, it was clear that they were the ones actually ramming the Philippines. It was clear, as bright as this you've shown. And the other incident which you have noted, if we look into the longer video and the ones that were taken also by the Philippine Coast Guard, you can see that the Philippine Coast Guard was right on its course. It was actually the Chinese Coast Guard that redirected its direction and eventually made it seem, based on that angle, based on that short clip, that it was the Philippines that tried to do it. But it was clear, if we look into the longer clip, that it was the Philippines that has been on course. And it was China that redirected its maneuvering, which eventually led to the clash. I mean, with the Philippines having limited Coastguard ships, do you think that it would be practical for the Philippines to to voluntarily destroy or create structural damages for its ships? I don't think that's practical or reasonable enough.
But wouldn't that be the case if the
but
Chinese ship is putting itself in the way of the Filipino ship? It's also sacrificing its ship to the clash.
But we could clearly see that the Chinese Coast Guard has, for the past while, not been acting like a Chinese Coast Guard based on international rules and norms, to the point that there have been calls in the Philippines to discredit the Chinese Coast Guard. It's acting like a warship, just painted in white. So we could clearly see, and if we look into the asymmetry, China has the largest navy as well. So I believe it has a surplus. If you'd like to compare it, of all these ships. But the main idea here is that it has been using these activities to further its interests. It's not the interest of the Philippines to provoke the situation at all. As we have seen it has been going on for. So it's definitely not in the interest of the Philippines to do so.
I'd just like to bring it back to the role of the United States here, because William mentioned this earlier. There's an upcoming election in the United States. Depending on who wins that election, is that going to have an impact on how assertive or not Beijing is in the South China Sea, and the same for Manila, as to whether Manila stands up more to Chinese assertiveness or not?
Well, absolutely. The U.S. election is something that we in Manila are very much eagerly observing, given, of course, the possible ramifications for the long term. Vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis the Philippine-U.S. alliance. But if we look into the direction, whether it would be Trump or whether it would be Harris, we could clearly say that the Philippines would still be an important element in the U.S. foreign policy, and I believe that the Philippines will still continue to gain bipartisan support. Because if you look at it, it was actually former President Donald Trump that continued to that he was clear in rejecting most of China's claims within the greater South China Sea, and the majority of that falls within the West Philippine Sea. And it was under Trump, as I mentioned earlier, twice, that clarified the scope of the MDT. But under Biden, the significance of the U.S.-Philippine alliance also grew considerably. So in this regard, if we see another Democrat, we may look into some level of continuity, institutionally speaking. But if we look into the Republican leaning, we could look at it based on the U.S.-China power competition. And in this regard, the role of the Philippines is important to bolster the U.S. position here as well. So if we look at it in both sides, right, the Philippines would still be significant in that regard.
Just to wrap it up with you, Don, because I know that you have to go. How do you see this panning out in the next few months? Do you see more such clashes on the high seas between Chinese and Filipino vessels? And depending on the result of the U.S. election, will things taper down or increase after January? How do you see this panning out in the next few months?
Well, unfortunately, what we are seeing now, it is likely that such activities from China would continue to persist, particularly in the Sabina Shoal, unless a significant level of cost of physical deterrence would be imposed on China's activities. So unfortunately, that's something that we may expect in the short to midterm, a continuation of such provocations. And it's critical, especially since the BRP Teresa Magbanua, for instance, is in need of more supplies, right? So we can see the nature of the situation right now. So I believe that China would try to continue what it is doing if no credible or significant level of cost would be applied on China.
Right. We'll leave it there for the moment. Don McLean, Gail, thanks so much for joining us this late from Manila. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. I hope you've had the same experience chatting with us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Till next time, Don. Take care. Thanks so much.
Take care.
And with that, should we have a look at the result
let's
of
take
the polls?
Let's take a look.
I don't know.
One thing just to quickly add, when he kept mentioning the West Filipino Sea, because
West Philippine Sea.
Well, West Philippine Sea, should I say. Of course, I'm sure lots of people are from the Philippines, so they know this already, but for people who are not, it is supposed to be part of this exclusive economic zone, again, close to the Philippines, so it's part of, obviously, the South China Sea. But just in case anyone was wondering what that is, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jared, I think we were waiting for results of the poll.
No problem.
What was the poll
We get up
question?
to 600 votes.
No, we nearly did. I was trying to get them up. We asked you, is war in the South China Sea now inevitable? And the responses were, well, the options we gave you, yes, no, don't know, not if diplomacy works. Does anyone know the answer who genuinely doesn't know and I want them to guess? Biresh, do you know?
Is war now inevitable?
What do you think came
I
out
mean, the
top?
answer, like what people thought was the
Most people thought from no? I don't know.
Most people thought yes.
Yes.
Well, 39%. So that came out in first. So 39% think yes, war in the South China Sea is now inevitable. But interestingly, the last three responses, so no, don't know, and not if diplomacy works, are all really within 2 to 3% of each other. So yeah, lots of people, I guess, not sure really.
Feels like it says something about the times we're living in now, that people see these relatively small clashes to the rest of the world, obviously not to Filipinos, and what they get from that is that war is inevitable. I mean, that would be a serious conflict if it did break out. So
Absolutely.
a little tragic in that respect, that people feel like war is inevitable.
I mean, the simulations on any conflict in the South China Sea, any escalation in the conflict, are rather scary because it draws in a number of countries simply because of these mutual defense treaties that exist. It's not just the Philippines. You also have South Korea, which has a security treaty with the United States, and don't forget Japan as well, which has its own problems with China. The thought is rather scary, but we don't want to sort of ruin it for everybody.
No.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thanks, everybody at the table. Alex, thanks for that context and those maps. Jared, thanks for monitoring the chat.
We will post what the topic is going to be for our next week. We always try to keep it up to date, so we don't know. We haven't decided about that yet, but we're going to post that topic on the community tab on our YouTube page. So look out for that and comment and add your questions as well, and we'll incorporate that into our
And that
show.
post should be hopefully going up on Tuesday next week. We shall see if we manage to
Yes,
have
we'll
that
do it.
deadline. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. See you all next time. Bye.
Thank you.